Good afternoon. My name is Melissa Niles. I am the Urban Agriculture Liaison with the South Dakota Specialty Producers Association. Thank you for joining us for Soil Health Under High Tunnels with Natalie Hoidal,
Hoidal.
Extension Agent from the University of Minnesota. This webinar was funded under a cooperative agreement between the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the South Dakota Specialty Producers Association, SDSPA, to promote sustainable agriculture practices and environmental stewardship. Its contents are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of the USDA or NRCS. Learn more about reaching out to our featured guest by visiting her website directly at the UMN Horticulture website at horticultureumn.edu, people/Natalie Hoidal. And I will have that in the chat. Good afternoon, Nellie.
Hello. Thanks for having me here today.
Yes, thanks for joining us on this beautiful spring day. It's springish. Minnesota, I'm sure, has the same weather as South Dakota. You can just blink and it'll be different the next day.
Yeah.
So today, the sun is shining. Not sure what
Yeah.
tomorrow brings. Now, Natalie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. So my name's Natalie Hoidal. I'm a vegetable crops educator with University of Minnesota Extension. I cover the whole state and I work with vegetable farmers on a little bit of everything. I'm kind of the generalist, so I work with soil health quite a bit and nutrient management. I also have like major focuses on high tunnels, climate adaptation, scaling up to wholesale production, and working with immigrant farmers on culturally relevant crops in Minnesota. And then I do a little bit of everything else, irrigation, whatever else comes up. So yeah, I've spent the last few years really focused on soils, both in urban settings and in more rural vegetable farms and high tunnels. So I'm going to be sharing some of that research today. And I guess I'd love to hear from those of you who are participating, if you want to share in the chat anything about who you are, whether it's your farm name, if you have a high tunnel, how many years you've been growing in it, if you're interested in a high tunnel, just to get a sense of who's here. That'd be great. And I will jump in, but I'll kind of keep an eye on that so we can see who's all here today. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. So today I'm going to be talking about a project called the 100 Farms Project, where we looked at soils at 100 diversified small-scale vegetable farms in Minnesota. And we defined small scale as less than 50 acres. And we specifically looked at high tunnels and fields at these farms to compare those two environments and see kind of some of the unique soil challenges in high tunnels. So just a little bit of background. High tunnels are relatively new in a US context. There are other places, China, southern Spain, where people have been growing in high tunnels for a long, long time. But we've seen a huge investment in high tunnels in the US in the last 10 to 15 years or so. So this data is a little bit old, but from 2010 to 2020, the Natural Resource Conservation Service invested $170 million into high tunnels and funded 26,000 high tunnels. Almost 200 of those were in South Dakota, almost 200 in North Dakota, almost 700 in Minnesota. And in the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of high tunnels as well. I don't have great data on that yet, but one of the things that I have noticed, so I've been in my role in Extension for about 8 years, and I go all over the state. I meet hundreds of farmers, and something that I was really consistently hearing was we build a high tunnel, things look great for like a year or two, a few years, and then after that, things don't look quite so good anymore. People start to see some issues with their tunnels. And there are a lot of different narratives about why that is. But just looking through the comments here, it looks like some of you are in the process of getting a high tunnel. Some of you are in your first season. Some of you, yeah, a lot of you are right in that first phase. So that's perfect because we really wanted to understand, like, if these problems are happening, can we understand why? And then can we work with people like you so that you're not making the same mistakes, so that you don't have the same problem in 3 to 5 years? And so there are a few narratives about why people have challenges in high tunnels. One of those is this sense that we really demand a lot out of our tunnels. We have high yields. We're often doing multiple succession plantings in a high tunnel over the same season. And so the soils are becoming depleted. So that's one common narrative that you'll hear. We also hear that salinity builds up due to a lack of rainfall. So we wanted to look into these things and see if there were any other factors that were causing challenges. Beyond that, so a big part of the focus of this project was high tunnels, but we also just wanted to look at nutrient management and soil management on small farms. Before I worked in agriculture, I worked in freshwater ecology. And so definitely think a lot about nutrient runoff into our freshwater ecosystems. And as I was going around the state talking to farmers, looking at soil tests, I was kind of noticing really high fertility, really high levels of phosphorus on people's soil tests, and wanted to see, is this a bigger problem, or am I just, focusing on these couple of things that I've seen and care about? So yeah, looking broadly at soil health and nutrient management, and then at those kind of key problems specific to high tunnels. So we put together a project in 2023. We had 17 educators around the state that went out to these 100 farms and did a bunch of testing. And then a big team of people, researchers on campus, looking at different aspects of soil health. Here's a map of the farms. So you will see there are not a lot of farms near South Dakota, right? We just kind of have fewer vegetable farms in Southwest Minnesota. We also don't have as many educators. And so that is part of that gap. And so I'm sharing Minnesota data. I think much of this will apply, but I also acknowledge that we were kind of far from the South Dakota border in this project. So I'll share just a little bit about who participated in this project, just so you can kind of compare yourself to the average farmer. So the average farm size, again, everybody was less than 50 acres, but on average, people were farming about 5 acres. The average person had been, or that land had been in vegetable production for about 7 years. So still technically a beginning farmer by the USDA definition, but people with some experience, although there was quite a range. And then people generally had about almost 4% organic matter in their soil, and a bit more in tunnels, about 5.4%. In terms of practices, this is something we see really consistently, and I wouldn't be surprised if it were similar in South Dakota. We are not big wholesale vegetable states. There are very few people growing for like Whole Foods or, these like huge companies where your organic certification really matters for accessing a market. We tend to have much smaller farms where people are doing direct to consumer sales. And so we pretty consistently see that like 10 to 20% of growers are certified organic, but then a very large percentage of growers are either exclusively using organic practices or mostly using organic practices. And they don't certify just because it's like they can tell their story really effectively to their customers, and it ends up not really being, they decide that it's not the best use of time to certify. So a lot of people using organic practices, even if they're not necessarily certified. And then a smaller percentage of people using conventional practices. So just starting with input use, thinking about what are people using in their soils for fertility. The most widely used fertility source in high tunnels in Minnesota is composted manure. So about 60% of people using composted manure at least once a year. And often that's like pelleted products. So like Sustain is a very commonly used product in Minnesota. We also see organic supplements, so things like blood meal, feather meal, quite a bit of vegetable compost, and much less fresh manure and synthetic fertilizers used in high tunnels. So this is pretty similar to the field. And something that is, so kind of a mix of animal and plant-based composts. And something that we saw in this study was that, so we went out to the farms, did a bunch of soil tests, a bunch of soil health tests, and also surveys. And we saw that while people are, for the most part, doing soil tests, like 60% of farmers were using soil tests to make decisions about fertility. When it came to composted manure, which is the most commonly used input, people weren't really using those soil tests. They were applying as much as they could get or a set amount of composted manure. And this was also true for vegetable compost every year. So that's just a little bit of background about like, who are these farmers? What are some of the practices that they're using? And now we're going to look at this question of what is going on in the soils of high tunnels. When you look at this picture, does anything stand out to you? Anyone want to share in the chat anything that's standing out? Yeah, James says salt. So this was one of the first things that we noticed when we went out and started sampling, was that a lot of the farms had this kind of white layer on top of the soil. So that, that definitely got us thinking and was one of the things that we looked into. But I'm actually going to start with this first idea that I mentioned earlier, this idea that high tunnel soils become depleted because we're just like taking so much out of them. So when we looked at the things that we would typically think about when we think about depletion of nutrients or organic matter, we actually saw the opposite happening. So the greenish blue bars on here are field averages, and then the maroon bars are high tunnel averages. And so we actually saw that our high tunnels, even though we have a longer season, we tend to produce more. They have more organic matter than fields. They have a lot more soil nitrate. They have quite a bit more soil phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. And these bars represent, at least for field soils, the very high threshold where like we wouldn't necessarily recommend any more phosphorus or any more potassium, calcium, or magnesium. And that point where we would consider it a very high organic matter soil. And so when we look at the nutrient data and the organic matter data, our high tunnel soils really don't look depleted at all. Actually, in many cases, our nutrients are far in excess of plant needs. So 87% of tunnels and 84% of fields had very high levels of phosphorus, for example. Calcium was really high in tunnels, and even high enough that in a lot of tunnels we were seeing calcium levels that could interfere with potassium uptake. So we're putting a lot into our tunnels, even though we're sometimes taking a lot out. So the second thing we looked at was salt accumulation. And I think that one of the first presentations I did about this data was at the South Dakota short course. And I shared that really early on in the project and said that we weren't seeing any salt accumulation, but we decided to rescreen all of our samples with a more accurate test. And when we did that, we did actually see some salt challenges. So 60% of the high tunnels that we looked at were not having salinity issues, but 26% did come back as very slightly saline, and 15% were moderately saline. And so just under half of tunnels were having at least some degree of salt accumulation. And even very slightly saline soils can interfere with germination of sensitive crops and cause plant stress. So there definitely was a connection to salts. We wanted to better understand what was driving those salts. So the first thing we looked at was just age. Like, does a tunnel just inherently become saltier? Does the soil accumulate more salt over time? And this is actually really good news. We did not see a trend here. So there were plenty of tunnels that were 5, 10, even 20 or 30 years into production that were not accumulating salts. So that's really good news. That means that this is not something that is inevitable when we're growing in high tunnels. We looked at the soil pH, thinking that that might be correlated, and really didn't see a strong relationship there. We looked at the water, thinking that water with really high alkalinity might contribute, and again, didn't see a really strong relationship. And then we looked at nutrients. And so the strongest relationship we saw was actually with soil nitrate. So many of the nutrients that our plants need are salts: potassium, calcium, magnesium, nitrate. These are all soluble salts. And our plants need those nutrients, but when those salts are in excess, they can cause problems. They can burn plant roots. And the strongest connection we saw was actually with nitrate. So that indicates that we are probably over fertilizing, and that is then creating problems for plant health. And so there are a few things to think about with that. One of the really common narratives, if we look at like extension websites or high tunnel growing guides, is this narrative that the best way to handle salts is to flush them out of the tunnel. So flooding your tunnel, letting that water pull salts out. And one, if the salts are coming from over applying nutrients, we can avoid that need to flush salts out by just applying less, right? And we're saving money in that process. We're saving resources. It's also worth noting that irrigation water is not necessarily going to be effective at leaching salts out of tunnels. And the reason for that is our irrigation water tends to have high alkalinity. There are a lot of dissolved solids in that water, and it's not going to be super effective at flushing salts out of the soil, even if it's not necessarily contributing salts. So rainwater, which has very low alkalinity, is going to do a much better job. And so if we're trying to flood our tunnels with irrigation water that already has high alkalinity, we may not actually be successful in that. So the other thing then is that if the salts in our tunnels are actually nutrients, and specifically nitrates, flushing them out is basically going to contribute nitrates into our groundwater, which is not great. So we see in places like southern Spain, where we just have acres and acres of greenhouses, and this practice of flushing salts is very common, that the nitrate contamination of groundwater becomes a problem. So we do have an issue with salts. Flushing them out may not be the best approach here. Rather, really careful nutrient management so that we're not overloading our systems with salt in the first place is probably a more important place to start. The next thing we looked at that could be causing problems in high tunnels was pH. So the acidity of your soil, your pH, is very important for your plants to be able to access nutrients in the soil. So that ideal range for pH is between 6 and 7. If you're too low, your plants can't effectively access nutrients. And if the pH is too high, you also can't effectively access nutrients. And so many growers were in that ideal range in the field, but the pH tended to be higher in high tunnels. And over half of the growers in our study had a soil pH that was outside of the optimal range. We did see that there was a slight trend that the pH increased over time in a high tunnel. That wasn't super significant. So again, it's not this message that like it's just going to happen, it's inevitable, but there was a bit of a trend. And the main thing we saw was that that was correlated with alkalinity in irrigation water. The only place in our study where we did not have irrigation water with really high alkalinity was along the North Shore of Minnesota, where there's more of like a granite bedrock. The rest of the state, which I think is very similar to South Dakota, we have a lot of calcium carbonate in the bedrock. And so our water alkalinity is just naturally really high. So in this study, we had the median person's irrigation water, so the average person's irrigation water had a pH of 7.9. Ideal is more like 5 to 7, so it was a bit high. And if you have not done an irrigation water test on your farm, I really recommend it just to see where you're at, how significant it is. So pH is one thing, and this is confusing because a pH that is basic is sometimes called alkaline, but that is actually a completely different measurement than alkalinity. So alkalinity has to do with dissolved solids and how easily the pH of your water can change. And so the ideal alkalinity for irrigation water is less than 100. And alkalinity is sometimes more important in an enclosed setting than pH. The average in our study was twice as high. And I have a strong feeling that you're going to see similar things in South Dakota. So this isn't great. It contributes to your soil potentially becoming more basic over time. And irrigation water with a high pH may also inhibit nutrient uptake a little bit. So again, we want to avoid flushing tunnels with water that has a high pH, but we also just may need to focus on dealing with this for, either reducing the pH of our water or finding ways to introduce other water to our systems. And I'm going to give some tips on that later, but just going to quickly cover this other thing that we looked at, which was just soil moisture and water dynamics in high tunnels. So one of the tests that we did was looking at infiltration, where we take a core, basically like a soup can with the ends taken off, it's a little sturdier, and we pour 107 milliliters of water into it, and that mimics 1 inch of rainfall. And so it allows us to see how quickly your soil can absorb a 1-inch rainfall. And then we actually do it again to see how quickly your soil could absorb a 2-inch rainfall. And generally, faster infiltration is better for soil health. So we don't want, like if our soil is really compact, infiltration is going to be really slow. So generally it's thought that fast infiltration is a good measure of soil health. But what we found in some high tunnels was that infiltration was so fast that it was causing problems. So in 26% of high tunnels, that first inch of water got absorbed in less than 30 seconds. And then that second inch of water got absorbed in less than 30 seconds in a fifth of the tunnels. So we saw this dynamic where basically as compost and sometimes soil dries out, it can become hydrophobic. So once it's really dry, it's very hard to re-wet. And so on farms where people had used a lot of compost and just left it on the surface, it created this dynamic where those top few inches of soil would not really absorb water. You would pour it through and it would just go straight down. It would stay dry on top. And it was especially challenging in tunnels where the soil underneath was heavier, where you had a clay, because then you had this dry zone, and then people would water it more frequently because the soil felt really dry on top. But then this clay soil below would become really saturated. So it was really tough on some of these farms to germinate seedlings, for seedlings to get established just because of that dry layer. But then they sometimes had issues with disease management later on because the soil would be so saturated underneath. And then again, we have some complicated soil moisture dynamics in a high tunnel where, especially if we're using organic inputs, we really need microbial activity. We need microbes to break down plant nutrients into plant available forms. A lot of nutrients need water. They need to move into the plant through water. And so when we have this dry root zone, it just creates some complicated dynamics around plant nutrient uptake and water uptake. We did try to understand microbial dynamics a little bit in this project, and we were not very successful. So we were very excited to look at arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So you've probably heard about arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi in the context of like popular news stories about trees talking to each other and sending nutrients back and forth. AMF provide really important structure to the soil. They help plants access nutrients. And we looked at the dormant spores of these in the soil and like really didn't see much going on. We didn't see differences between tunnels or fields. We didn't see differences with different practices. And so I think we just looked at it kind of in the wrong way, unfortunately. We also looked at aggregate stability. So an aggregate in the soil is kind of just like a clump of soil particles held together by roots and microbes and kind of natural glues that are produced by living organisms in the soil. And aggregates are really important because they help the soil withstand disturbance. So really heavy rainfall event comes. If your soil has good aggregate stability, it will stay intact. If it doesn't, it's likely to dissolve and run off. So we saw very significant impacts to aggregate stability when we started to look at soil health practices like tillage, like the addition of organic matter. But in terms of differences between fields and high tunnels, we didn't see much. So basically, when we stepped back and we went back to this question of what is causing problems, we were able to say we really are not seeing depletion happening. We're not, this idea that our soils are getting tired or depleted is not super accurate. Instead, we're seeing the accumulation of salts predominantly from applying too many inputs, probably. We're seeing pH issues due to our irrigation water. And then we're just seeing weird water dynamics, like physical water dynamics from the soil getting too dry. And it's worth mentioning that there was one big thing we did not study. So one of the reasons we can see significant problems after 3 to 5 years is if we're not rotating our crops really well, we can really build up soil-borne pathogens. So this was not part of our study, but it is one of the things that can cause problems. And so other researchers have found that in high tunnels, we have less rotation. Often we're growing the same crop every year because we only have one high tunnel. We've got warmer soil and air, which may allow certain pathogens to do really well. We have moisture stress, and then we have periods of high humidity. And we also often have a lot more organic matter. And there are certain pathogens in the soil that really thrive on decomposing organic matter. So we do often see, we being other researchers, more incidents of pathogens like sclerotinia, downy mildew, nematodes, rhizoctonia, fusarium. So that is one other factor to consider here beyond just the salts, the pH, and the water dynamics. So beyond this, we really wanted to look at soil health in tunnels and see what are positive practices that growers can do to inform soil health. So we did a whole bunch of tests. We tested some of these newer soil health tests that are often marketed to farmers. So you may have seen like doing a cation exchange capacity test or active carbon, which kind of looks at the different fractions of carbon to say, what is the carbon that's really easily accessible to microbes, like the microbe candy, versus more stable forms of carbon in the soil. And we really found that these things were super well correlated with just organic matter. And so it's kind of cool to do these things. May not be worth your time or money, at least at this point as a grower, to pay for these extra tests beyond just looking at your organic matter. And as I mentioned earlier, looking at the fungi, we didn't have super conclusive results there. In terms of things that built aggregate stability, so this is one of the most important ways that we can look at the physical health of our soil. More tillage was probably the most significant driver of aggregate stability. So the more someone tilled, the less aggregate stability they had in their soil. That's a pretty basic common narrative. Reducing tillage is one of the most core principles of soil health. And we were able to confirm that in this study. We really did see differences. When people tilled less, they had more stability. We also saw benefits to using plant-based composts. We, in this study, didn't really see the same benefits from manure. But there are people who have done much more controlled studies where you're like applying it and then seeing the results that do see those benefits. But in this study, really reducing tillage, using plant-based composts were two of the things that most significantly benefited soil health. Unfortunately, we didn't actually see significant benefits of cover crops, but I think what we have deduced from this is that the benefits of cover crops can take a long time. You won't necessarily see them the next season. And a lot of these farmers were just beginning, especially in high tunnels. And so we just might not have had enough time to really see those benefits. And actually, the other thing I'll mention that's not on here is that organic certification was the other really significant driver of soil health benefits, both aggregate stability, infiltration, organic matter, and then bulk density, which is a matter of compaction. Certified organic farmers actually did have better soil health than people who were just using organic practices or who were farming conventionally. So just kind of interesting. So what do we do with some of this information? First is really thinking about that nutrient management. If it's nutrients that are mostly contributing to salts, and in some cases we have really high concentrations of nutrients that could be considered a water quality concern, getting as much support as you can, whether that's through extension, sometimes even your soil water conservation district can support you to develop a nutrient management plan so that you know you're applying what your plants need, not a lot more, not a lot less. Strategies for dealing with salts. So again, avoiding salt accumulation in the first place is ideal. So thinking about nutrient contributions of compost and manure, using foliar testing to adjust your fertilization plans. That's like a way to kind of fine tune your nutrient management plan. Using cover crops for nitrogen. We often see when people are really relying on organic nutrient sources that basically things like composted manures have more phosphorus and potassium than they do nitrogen. And so if we're really relying on those to meet our plant needs, we end up over applying that phosphorus and that potassium. And sometimes those products they can have salts in them. And so that's one of the ways that salts build up. And so finding ways to provide nitrogen, whether that's really specific sources like blood meal or feather meal, can help. And using cover crops is a great way to add nitrogen to a tunnel without adding extra salts. One of the, I think, really key practices is finding ways to allow rainwater into your tunnel. And so it is not practical, and I do not recommend that you take the plastic off your tunnel every winter, but you are going to have to change that plastic every 5 years or so. And so in that year where you're going to skin your high tunnel anyways, really consider just leaving the plastic off for the winter and letting some moisture come in. Movable tunnels are becoming more and more common. The NRCS payments for high tunnels by square foot have really significantly increased over the last 5 years or so. And so we've actually seen some farmers in Minnesota who have been able to completely cover the cost of a movable tunnel. So it's on tracks and it can move to like 3 different positions. And so that really allows you to do crop rotation, to get rainfall into that soil, even if you just have one tunnel that's moving back and forth. Some people actually will, I know you don't have as much snow cover in South Dakota as we get here, but during snowstorms, people will like shovel snow into their high tunnel as a way of doing that. And then really consider flooding as kind of a last resort. I'm not saying you can never do it. I think there's definitely a time and a place for it if you've really accumulated a lot of salts. But just be mindful about what those salts are and make sure you're doing it with a water source, ideally rainwater or surface water if you're considering food safety aspects of that. That's going to effectively flush those salts out. So ways to deal with high pH and low soil moisture. So this is a little bit trickier. And actually, I think these same strategies are still your best bets. So reducing, like only using as many inputs as you need, testing for salts and high pH inputs, and removing the plastic for periods of time. Those are going to be kind of like your foundational best ways of dealing with pH. There are farmers who acidify their irrigation water. There are pros and cons to this. They, in the short term, acidifying your irrigation water brings the pH down. If you're not certified organic, it's very common to do this with sulfuric acid, sometimes nitric acid. In an organic system, you can only do this with certified organic citric acid. And so it can be a little bit expensive. And the other thing is when you're using these acid products, you may actually be contributing more salts to your tunnel. So it's kind of a delicate balance. And I didn't write this on here, but actually one other way is to add elemental sulfur to your tunnel. So just in the same way that lime, you might add lime to a soil that's too acidic, sulfur can also help to bring down the pH in the other direction. And we on our extension website have some specific recommendations about rates if that's an approach you want to take. And then with moisture, when we visited these 100 farms, we went out in April and May before people planted, and the majority of them were just empty. So they had just been bare for the whole winter, and the soil was super dry. And so cover crops can be one great way of keeping living roots in the soil over the winter. You do want to irrigate them, just because if a cover crop is growing without any irrigation, it's actually going to pull more moisture out of the soil. But keeping living roots in the soil and keeping some moisture in that soil over the winter will help it from like drying down too much to the point that it's hard to re-wet again. The other piece here that is not listed is just incorporating your compost if you can. So trying to avoid that situation where you have this fully separate layer of compost and then soil, but instead working it into the soil a bit so that it kind of becomes more a part of that soil ecosystem. Cover crops, there, I think a couple of you might be part of this trial. We're actually doing a cover crop trial right now. We have about 40 farmers trying cover crops in their high tunnels. And there are 3 windows, so people who are planting in the fall and terminating now. And then some people who do winter spinach are kind of just finishing up their spinach harvest, and they're going to do a quick cover crop now before they plant their summer crops. And then there are some farmers that really specialize in spring and fall production, and they don't do as much growing in their high tunnel over the winter. And so there are a few people who are going to be doing cover crops in the summer. So if you have any interest in doing this, feel free to reach out and we can send you free seed. We have farmers that are doing much more intensive trials where they're collecting data, and then a whole network of farmers where we just send you free seed and you do a little survey at the end to say like, yeah, it went well. Yeah, it didn't. Here's a reflection, just to kind of try to get more of that input on, you know, not just the data, but is this something that farmers are seeing benefits from? And are we learning from each other about the best methods for seeding or termination or things like that? And then, so this is more kind of when we zoom out from the high tunnel. One of the things that I didn't get into as much in this talk, just because we were talking specifically about high tunnels, is that we did see like really, really high phosphorus levels on most of the farms that we went to. So well beyond that very high threshold, and to the point where we really start to worry about runoff. And so mitigating nutrients that are already there essentially looks like just good soil health practices where we're mitigating runoff. So phosphorus in particular really binds to soil. So anytime soil is leaving your field, phosphorus may also be leaving your field. So checking in with your local natural resource conservation service, your soil water conservation service. I realize most of you are not in Minnesota, but we've got an ag water quality certification program. It also provides funding and technical assistance. And I know these practices are often more tailored to large scale farms, but small farms can really benefit from buffers with perennials. So those could be strips of flowering plants, those could be fruit trees, things like berms, getting support to plant more cover crops. And then just focusing on those basic soil health principles of keeping the soil covered, minimizing disturbance, having a lot of diversity in the landscape. These are all things that are going to keep soil on the landscape and also keep our nutrients in place. And I will end by just saying I'm very excited that yesterday we published a new webpage, so a health and nutrient management in high tunnels. This is for Minnesota, but I think most of this is very relevant to you all in South Dakota. So we've actually determined nutrient management guidelines for at least tomatoes and cucumbers in high tunnels because these plants are producing a lot more in a high tunnel than they are in the field. They have different nutrient needs. They're quite a bit higher for nitrogen and potassium. Other things like carrots or beets, that carrot is still just going to be a carrot, right? So it's going to grow faster, but we don't necessarily see higher yields. And so we can stick with field-based recommendations. But this webpage kind of outlines all of that and goes much more in depth on like how to achieve those fertilization rates, things like fertilizing through your drip irrigation, adding compost to the soil, best practices for that. So it's more of a deep dive on what I started to touch on today. So with that, I will wrap up and we've got a little bit of time for questions.
Excellent presentation. In your presentation, there were clapping hands that came up. So yeah, she welcomes any questions right now. You feel free to type them out in the chat. I know we're not all real quick typists, so we'll give them a couple minutes.
Will do.
Okay.
So James is asking for the URL, so I'm just gonna stick it in the chat here.
Yeah, I hear so much about the salinity in high tunnels. I've never really thought about how we could get aggregated. So that was really interesting to learn about all this because you think of just flushing it, but you're like, wait a minute, what if the water is the problem? So I really learned a lot today. I guess James Bell has a couple questions for us.
Yeah, so just asking about other common mistakes that beginning high tunnel owners make. Any tips? Sure. So I guess coming back to soil, I would say one thing that I see a lot of people do is feel like you need a perfectly flat surface to grow on. And so I see people like bringing in equipment to level the soil, and then really having compaction issues from that process. And so while it is absolutely true that you want a relatively flat spot, by taking that a little too far and leveling the site, having all that compaction right when you're beginning is going to cause a lot of problems. And so just good site selection versus artificially leveling a site is one, I think, key thing that I see people do. Another thing I would say is not having enough ventilation. So most high tunnel kits are not complete. Like you order a high tunnel and you still have to do a bunch of stuff. You have to build the end walls, you have to add in ventilation. So making sure you have enough ventilation for your tunnel. And like I would say a lot of farmers don't have gable vents. So at the ends of your tunnel, you really want to have a big vent because even if you have roll up sides, the hot air rises and it needs a place to leave. And so you need spaces on the top of your tunnel for hot air to leave. So having those gable vents, and even having, if you have electricity, you often want to have a fan that is powered that can actually bring air into your tunnel. And you can look up like a CFM calculator. I should I should know what that stands for, and at the moment I'm blanking. But basically, for the size of your tunnel, you can find calculators that tell you like how big of a fan do you need and how big of a vent system do you need. So that's another thing I see people not doing enough of, is just not having enough ventilation, which creates issues with heat. It creates issues with moisture. Soil moisture sensing. We have to take water a little bit more seriously in a high tunnel. And just a basic investment in some tensiometers can really do a lot for helping you fine tune that, that process. And yeah, I think we talked about fertility a little bit today, having a good fertility plan. Those are some key things that I would really start with. Planning for plant diseases. So kind of looking up the key diseases that affect the plants you're going to grow, making sure you're buying resistant varieties. That was a big laundry list, but those are the key things that come to mind when I think of like you're just getting started. What are some things you really want to focus on to be successful? So Julie's asking, how do you correct compaction without tilling? Great question. So tilling, it's kind of funny because tilling in the short term makes our soil feel less compact. We're kind of adding a bunch of air to the soil. But when we till, we are actually creating compaction problems because we're chopping that soil into smaller pieces, breaking up aggregate. And so over time, even though in the short term it adds some air, we're creating conditions that lead to compaction. And so reducing tillage, if you have a really compact soil that you're starting with, sometimes you have to till once just to kind of get in there, but using cover crops, if you can, using a permanent bed system. So keeping your walkways as walkways and your beds as beds so that you're really reducing foot traffic and any equipment traffic you're bringing in. Using a broad fork can be a great strategy to break up that soil a little bit. Add in some air without doing that process of like chopping it up into small pieces. Those are kind of some of the key strategies, I guess. Any idea of what fish emulsion fertilizer does when salinity is high? So yeah, fish emulsion it's a really common product to use in a high tunnel. Tends to be like 5% nitrogen, 1% phosphorus, 1% potassium. So it's a nice way to get some nitrogen into your tunnel. Just like pretty much any other organic type fertilizer, like blood meal or feather meal, if you're over applying it, it can contribute to salt problems. But as long as you're applying within kind of the needs of your plant, it's a great option for fertility. Molasses and alfalfa may be lower in salts. I'm not sure offhand, but like alfalfa seed meal is definitely a product that people use, or even like planting alfalfa as a cover crop or adding alfalfa straw could probably add a bit of nitrogen. It might be a little harder to calculate how much you're actually getting from that. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say about that comment. But if you have any specific follow-up questions, feel free to ask me. Maybe I'll just say, if you look at that webpage, you will see there's a lot about nitrogen credits. So if you just look at the nitrogen recommendation, it's going to be really high. It's like 300, 350 pounds an acre of nitrogen. But in a high tunnel, we have a lot of nitrogen credits to think about. So it's really worth doing a soil nitrate test in the spring to see how much nitrate is already there. often it's quite high. And so you can subtract that whole amount from your initial recommendation. The other thing in Minnesota, we have a lot of nitrates in our groundwater. And so on, just as an example, one of the research farms that we have high tunnels at, we're getting like 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre just from irrigating. And that's harder to calculate in the field because you're mostly relying on rain and then supplementing. Whereas in a high tunnel, you're fully providing all of the water through irrigation. And so calculating in that credit will really lower the amount of nitrogen you need to be adding. And then again, right, if we're adding too much nitrogen, that's contributing to salts. And so, yeah, definitely worth doing that crediting process. Oh, the URL didn't work. Interesting. Maybe I did it wrong. Oh, you know what? I only sent it to myself. Okay, now I'm sending the URL to everyone. Thank
I
you.
was going to say it worked for me, but I see how it says just for hosts.
Okay, so that's the URL. Are there any alternatives you'd recommend for bringing soil more acidic without using sulfur? So yeah, the three options are taking the plastic off to let some rainwater in, or moving your high tunnel, using sulfur, specifically elemental sulfur, or acidifying your water. And we, on our extension, University of Minnesota Extension website, we do have some pages about acidifying irrigation water. But yeah, that's kind of a trade-off. You're acidifying the water, but it's not necessarily going to change the soil pH. You're still muted, Melissa.
Yeah, I was just seeing if anybody else had any more questions here. Our time is getting short, but I can get out and enjoy this beautiful day, which clouded over while we've been sitting here. You know, we need the rain too, so hey. Go. Well, I would like to thank you, Natalie, for joining us today. I know I learned a lot about. I've been thinking about a high tunnel, so this has been very helpful for me. We appreciate your time and just thank you. I'll make sure we didn't miss a question. We appreciate your time and knowledge in soil health and high tunnels. Feel free to contact her at her email, which we have listed. And when we set it out on YouTube, I'll make sure those contacts are down below also, and that URL. This webinar has been funded through a conservation collaboration agreement between the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the South Dakota Specialty Producers Association to promote sustainable agriculture practices and environmental stewardship. Its contents are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of the USDA or NRCS. Again, my name is Melissa Niles. I'm the Urban Ag Liaison for SDSPA, and visit our website at sdspecialtyproducers.org to view upcoming events, find producers, and become a member. Thank you, Natalie. And you're getting lots of claps in the coming through. So
all right. Well, looks like many of the people here are growing in a high tunnel for the first time this season. So hope it goes well. Yeah, thanks again for having me.